Hi, Alf.
Hi, Leah.
So I want to talk about poverty. The new First Minister says he wants to eradicate poverty in Scotland. So we know that over 20% of all Scots live in poverty. And we also know that people who are poor don't achieve their potential. Their educational attainment tends to be lower. Their housing is substandard. They often have unhealthier lifestyles and worse health outcomes. And they're more highly stressed and are likely to die sooner. Alf, you said the level of poverty in a nation is equivalent to the extent of the plunder it has undergone. So the UK has imposed what we'd call the Anglo-Norman wealth extraction model onto Scotland, when a nation's assets are sold off to private corporations for profit. It seems to me that to tackle the roots of poverty, wealth must be returned to the people, something our politicians don't ever mention. And a natural wealth generator for Scotland used to be its maritime ports. Can you explain what happened to this source of wealth?
Well, yes, our major historic cities developed around their seaports, which reflected their trading relationships, both coastal and across the sea. The boroughs, the ancient boroughs owned the ports, then local councils after reorganisation, and some still do, such as in Orkney, where the council has a harbours department running most of the ports across the 17 inhabited islands there. The UK government in the 1960s created statutory port authorities for the whole estuaries and firths for Forth, Clyde and Tay, the major estuaries and firths in Scotland. These new trust ports, which is an English model of governance, were constituted as independent port authorities. All the borough ports in these firths were removed from council ownership and control and transferred into these large semi-private trusts. The port sustained the whole economy at one time, creating much of the wealth of the entire town or city and region it served through the merchants, the commerce, and meeting the local and regional population's needs for imports and exports. Entire cities were therefore built on the ports and trade flowing through them, and they raised substantial revenues from taxes on goods and ships, which enabled the boroughs to reinvest in new port infrastructure as trade expanded and ships got bigger. And this was the case for Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dundee, as well as Aberdeen, the major cities in Scotland. A valid question here was the right, if any, of the UK government to take the ports from the boroughs and to transfer their ownership, commercial operations, rights, and responsibilities to what are really semi-private or were semi-private trusts. Whilst the boroughs operated ports in the public interest, the new and imposed trust port model was found to operate primarily in the interests of private trustees. Trustees were often those appointed from commercial interests such as stevedores, shipping operators, merchants, as well as representatives of other commercial entities such as banks and law firms, plus usually a couple of local councillors. The trusts were arguably less representative of local communities and instead prioritised vested interests. It was also the case that ownership of trust ports remained uncertain, even according to the government, who described them as being in a kind of limbo, neither public nor private. Then in the 1991 Ports Act, introduced by the then UK Transport Secretary Malcolm Rifkin, this brought about further major change. This was what was called an enabling act, which allowed the port trustees to sell each port to a private successor company through a bidding process. In two cases, Clyde and Dundee, the ports were bought by MBOs, management buyouts, which were led by former trust port officials, public officials. So the trust officials were basically selling the ports to themselves. Forth Ports was slightly different. It went straight for a listing on the London stock market, therefore avoiding a bidding process entirely, and with the former trust port senior management remaining in post and becoming shareholders in the new entity itself. A curious aspect of all sales was that as the UK government admitted that ownership of trust ports remained uncertain, the government only took half the levy proceeds from the sales, leaving the other half with the new, now private, subsequent owners. This, of course, only further benefited the new private owners at public expense. The boroughs, or now local councils, received nothing from these port sales, despite the fact they had originally built and owned the ports, which in all cases involved very substantial land areas, in the case of Forth and Clyde stretching to thousands of hectares of prime waterfront land, and the length of the rivers, as well as jurisdiction over several hundred square miles of navigable waterways. In addition, the port trusts were all highly profitable enterprises with significant annual surpluses and reserves, none of which reverted to the boroughs, instead all going to the benefit of the private successor companies and shareholders who had acquired the assets for very little. Since privatisation of the trusts in 1991-92, the private port owners have sold on the ports to offshore private equity funds. The ports sold for very high or inflated prices, which reflected the high profits that they make, and their local monopoly position on each estuary as the only port supplier. However, the private equity model does not allow for reinvestment in new port infrastructure. This is because the ports are bought in what are highly leveraged transactions, with fund investment treated as debt, which is then transferred onto the port company balance sheet, making it look as if it's highly indebted. High profits are used to repay the interest on this debt, leaving little for investment in new port infrastructure. And so speculative private equity funds who now own the ports then sit on derelict port land for years waiting on an opportune time to redevelop it. And usually this is dependent on other private or public sector investors coming forward. In the meantime, they secure high returns from levying taxes and dues on ships and cargo and trade. So this is in stark contrast between what are these major estuarial ports and the few remaining municipal-owned ports, such as in Orkney and Shetland. In the Northern Isles, the councils, formerly boroughs, continue to own their ports and were able to build up large sovereign wealth funds from the North Sea oil tanker business through charging port dues on ships and goods. And they also levy port dues on many ferries and cruise ships, as well as other vessels. This revenue provides for an additional significant source of income to these councils, which today employ large numbers of people involved in maritime activity. And this also creates surpluses used for general council use. For example, in Shetland, the large oil fund helped pay for the building of leisure centres and swimming pools in most parishes and on the outer isles as well, and also helped pay for major road upgrades, for maintaining internal ferry services and piers, as well as a wide range of other economic and social development initiatives. And just to note, it's also worth mentioning that the UK government transferred borough and council-owned airports into a UK agency, similarly as they did with the trust ports, into what was originally BAA, British Airports Authority. And then, like major seaports, BAA was subsequently privatised in the late 80s, early 90s, floated on the London Stock Exchange, and has since also been sold on to offshore private equity funds based on the same dysfunctional financial model as ports.
Wow. So basically, the UK government robbed the Scottish people of their ports and the wealth that they had been generating for local communities for a very long time. I'd next like to ask you something that unionists often claim is that Scotland benefited enormously from the British Empire. Is this true?
Well, I would say Scotland as a nation did not necessarily benefit from the Empire project. Our infrastructure today is very poor, even compared to former colonies such as Dubai, Singapore, and Ireland. Decolonisation enabled these countries to develop their strategic infrastructure, build trade, and develop their economy. Scotland is much less developed. Scotland's economic role then is, and now is, primarily to serve the needs of what we might call the mother country. Think of where most of our oil, gas, and renewable energy goes at very low prices to meet the needs of our large neighbour, England. Only a tiny and mostly anglicised Scottish elite ever benefited from empire. Most Scottish people lived in poverty, and many still do, lacking opportunity, resulting in mass migration, with a loss of some 4 million people over the period of the Union, which is one of the biggest losses of population in Europe for a country of Scotland's size.
Yeah, so that's interesting that we'd be a nation almost double the size we currently are had we been independent. That's quite amazing. This level of massive depopulation is yet another sign of Scotland's de facto colony status within the UK, I would argue. However, I read in a recent letter in The Scotsman, a unionist wrote that the notion that Scotland is a colony is absurd because colonies don't send MPs to Westminster, and native Scots take part in all aspects of Scottish government and society. How would you respond?
Well, a colonial or non-sovereign territory has no control over its lands, resources, or its people. Primarily, colonialism is about economic exploitation, as we can see still occurring. Secondly, colonialism involves external political control, and Scotland is clearly run by Westminster and its legislation dominated by England's MPs. This legislation allows for and enables the economic plunder of Scotland's assets and resources, as we see for ports, for utilities, for energy, and so on. Thirdly, there is what is known as cultural colonialism. Colonial powers impose cultural assimilation processes which seek to alter the identity of a people. This is done linguistically. So while English studies is prioritised and given authority, the Scots languages, Scots and Gaelic, are not. This has recently been rectified for Gaelic, but not the Scots language, which is not taught to the Scottish people. In this regard, the history of the colony is marginalised and considered subordinate and invalid, as is the native language. Education, media, and public authority is provided only in what we call the colonisers' language. This leads to the psychological condition we know as the colonial mindset, where people accept their subordinate position as deserved, and they must adopt the colonisers' culture and language if they wish to make socio-economic progress. The meritocratic elite and cultural hegemony then is primarily Anglophone, reflecting a cultural division of labour in what is known as the internal colonialism model. All the top positions are advertised primarily in the metropolitan capital. Colonialism is also about obliteration of the native culture, history, tradition, heritage, and language of the colonised people, who are effectively out of the game in an international sense. Post-colonial theory explains that the quest for independence is therefore a fight for a national culture, as well as to reclaim sovereignty. And without a Scottish veto over English decisions, there is no union as such. A great many colonies were left holding violated treaties, and Scotland seems no different in this respect. The union is therefore a cultural illusion, and the question of independence a cultural emotion.
Yeah, well put. So we talk about the Scottish people being sovereign over any government or parliament. The 1689 Claim of Right certainly asserts this. But the fact that the land and resources have been taken from the Scottish people without their consent is a violation of the Treaty of Union, and surely enough reason to end it. Why do you think our politicians have failed to stand up and object to this blatant theft?
Well, returning again to post-colonial theory, it helps explain what happens. People seeking self-government give their support to a single national party promising independence. However, as the decisive moment in the fight for independence gets closer, the National Party elite, which is usually made up of the more pampered bourgeoisie class, takes a different approach. Afraid of the oppressor's tanks and planes, it reaches a compromise with the colonial power. The National Party elite instead uses its power to feather its nest, build up its pensions. It takes the people up successive blind alleys, becoming an instrument of coercion itself by holding the people back and attacking so-called radical independence leaders. This realization sickens the people and leads to a rupture in the movement, which then transforms into a liberation movement, with the creation of new national parties bringing more urgency to the cause. This is more or less what we see happening in Scotland, which implies that we are likewise following a well-trod decolonisation template.
Yeah, and in really since 2007, it seems the SNP administration has continued the sell-off of Scotland's assets, again, sort of in line with the Anglo-Norman wealth extraction model. And it's done this, interestingly, by promoting foreign investment and essentially making it easier for foreign companies to come in and buy up our assets. Funny, it doesn't create many jobs here in Scotland. And of course, the profits these companies make are then repatriated to their headquarters abroad, which tend to be in Europe and the United States. And so really none of the major sectors of the Scottish economy, you go from banking to finance to agribusiness, even building construction, are really Scottish owned. Even our renewables now are foreign owned. At the end of last year, the Scottish government sold licenses to develop huge areas of offshore wind for pittance to foreign companies, and we get very little from this arrangement. How do we get our wealth back?
The theft of Scotland's resources and wealth needs to be ended, and can only be ended through independence and the reclaiming of their sovereignty by the Scottish people. What Scots need to do is to be aware of the true nature and value of the plunder that's going on, as well as where this occurs. And we can see this with port lands and airports, as well as various other utilities where ownership and interception of the value of trading has been unlawfully intercepted by our procurer. The rightful ownership of these vast port city estates should be returned to the local communities. Ports and airport authorities should be publicly owned, reflecting the fact these are public goods and also that these assets have effectively been stolen. Similarly, we need to get a handle on the real value of our trade, such as energy resources, oil, gas, renewables, and so on. Renewable energy alone supplied by Scotland to England could be worth an estimated £40 billion in retail sales per annum, yet it has more or less been given away to developers. In the colonial environment, resources are extracted at very low prices, with goods sold back to the territory by the colonial power at high prices. Scotland could have a publicly owned energy company as one option, and there are laws which could be introduced in an effort to secure a fairer share of the real value of all of these resources. Other major industry sectors where Scots receive little from the immense value of trade include whisky and aggregates. Official estimates put whisky exports worth around £5 billion annually. However, STUC officials have suggested the correct figure could be closer to £30 billion. Clearly, a national government would need to ensure it has an accurate picture of what Scotland produces, where it goes, how much it is really worth, and who receives this value, which should be regarded at the moment as interception of economic rents. There are many actions which could be taken by a people once they reclaim sovereignty from an exploitative imperial power. Examples could include a national investment bank with far greater resources and also promoting exports, the development of community enterprises, and perhaps the return of the borough's local governments model, allowing for improved local administration and protection of the common good, which is an important aspect already within the Scottish Constitution, which has been hidden from us, as revealed by Salvo. There is so much we can do. Government policies can help create and stimulate local wealth. Our Nordic neighbours have done it, and so can we. Scotland is a nation of just over 5 million, perhaps over 6 million, with the hidden census hiding a rapid increase in migration from the rest of the UK. Sovereignty also means taking control over our borders. Like all other independent countries, it does not take much to alter a population of around 5 million people with an open border, much as we see, especially with a 10 times larger population next door who are keen to intercept another country's economic rents. This interception may come at a very high cost to the smaller populated nation, not least in terms of its sovereignty. Open borders means a loss of sovereignty when there are no national protections in place to protect the indigenous population. Controls are clearly needed on property sales to limit buyers from outside Scotland and ensure there are sufficient houses for Scots, and to prevent property prices rising beyond affordable levels because of far greater buying power of those coming from other countries. It is claimed our population is highly educated, yet a rather low percentage of Scots go to university, around 30%, with most of the university places at elite institutions reserved for higher fee students or elites coming from outside Scotland. Only around 1 in 10 of the academic staff at Scotland's elite universities are Scottish. So we have to lift up our people rather than exclude them from opportunities. Otherwise, we are maintaining an anti-Scottish cultural division of labour, which is actually ethnic discrimination and always a feature of colonialism. Part of the problem is that all professional and managerial jobs, as I said earlier, in Scotland are advertised in the London press and therefore aimed at a market 10 times larger than Scotland, and with only an English language requirement, there being no requirements for Scots or Gaelic language knowledge. This is rather like Denmark advertising all its top jobs in Berlin and insisting all applicants only speak German, Danish not being required. Scots have become used to this, but is effectively ethnic discrimination, which results in socio-linguistic prejudice. Colonialism leads to an underdeveloped nation and a people, as we see, who lack opportunity in their own land, which means if Scotland stays in the UK, that is our only prospect. As the value of colonial plunder is considered equivalent to the poverty and deprivation suffered by a colonised people, this implies that it is necessary to end the plunder before a people can bring an end to poverty and restore prosperity for all Scots. So when National Party politicians say they want to eradicate poverty within a colonial environment still run by a colonial administration, this remains highly unlikely. Here, politicians are merely demonstrating their rudimentary understanding of the challenge and confirming they have yet to undertake even a reasoned study of colonial society. In order to eradicate colonial-induced poverty and allow the people and nation to fully develop by also giving them access to their own resources, first they must eradicate colonialism and liberate the people.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that's what has to happen. Thank you, Alf. This has been a fascinating discussion. If you would like to join the Scottish Liberation Movement, please go to liberation.scot, and together we can put the Scottish people back in charge of their nation and its resources, and then really truly end poverty.